Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, and sometimes in between, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to academic.oup.com/bioscience. On today's episode, we'll be talking fireflies, the threats they face, and some of the ways those threats might be lessened. You've probably seen some of the press coverage of this article already, so we tried to dig in a little bit deeper and capture some of the detail that you might not have already seen. And for this interview, I'm joined by Sara Lewis and Michael Reed of Tufts University, as well as Candace Fallon of the Xerces Society. And without further ado, let's go straight to that interview. Thank you all very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
It's great to be here.
Before we get into some of the specific threats that are facing fireflies, I thought it might be helpful for our listeners to kind of briefly discuss exactly which species we're talking about. I and many of our listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with the fireflies that we see populating our backyards on summer nights. But we're really talking about a diversity of species here. Can you give us a brief overview of that?
So one of the things that takes a lot of people aback is learning that there isn't just a single species of firefly. People are really surprised to learn that there are more than 2,000 different kinds of fireflies around the world. And so part of what we're trying to do is to differentiate among these species and figure out which ones are most at risk.
And these species, are they spread worldwide?
Yeah, so fireflies are found all around the world, pretty much on every continent except for Antarctica. And in North America, we have, Candace, about 150 odd species of fireflies. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I think too, one of many things that many people may not know about fireflies is that, we have our flashing species, but there are also day-active fireflies as well as glowworms, which aren't quite as, flashy as their name suggests.
Okay, great. And so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the survey you conducted. Who were you surveying, and what kinds of things were you asking them?
So this paper is based on a survey that we conducted of firefly experts around the world. So we sent the survey out by email to about 350 people who are members of the Fireflies International Network. This is a group of firefly scientists, conservationists, people who are, some of them are like tourist guides, tour operators. These are people who are really familiar with fireflies in their local area. So they're not like random people that we, dragged in off the street. They're people who go out at night and they're out there, in the dark, looking at fireflies night after night after night, season after season after season. And so it basically falls into the category of expert opinion. And we asked them to score each of about a dozen possible threats, to score each one as what they consider to be, on a scale from 0 to 5, what they consider to be the most important threats to fireflies in their geographical region.
Okay, and we've talked a lot on this show, and I'm sure most of our listeners will be familiar with the fact that many insect species are under threat right now. But what are the threats facing fireflies like?
Well, fireflies aren't that different from a lot of species in that habitat loss globally seems to be the top threat. But they also are affected by pesticides, which seem to be clobbering insects worldwide. Artificial light at night is an issue that's more specialized for fireflies because they actually depend on light for signaling. And in parts of the world, harvest seems to be a problem. There used to be a bigger problem here in the U.S., but it's less of a problem now.
And what would harvest refer to in that description?
Well, not so much kids running around with jars capturing things, but for a long time, there was more formal harvest in the U.S. that was done on behalf of chemical companies that harvested species to get luciferase, which is a key ingredient in making their little butts glow. And it's also used in medical world as a bacteria indicator. So it's, until it was synthesized, it was the only real source of this. So they used to pay kids to go out and harvest millions of fireflies.
I wanted to touch briefly on habitat loss, if you don't mind. In what ways are those habitats threatened globally? Is this land that's being cleared for subdivisions or human establishments? Is it farmland, or is it all of the above, that kind of thing?
So, there are some species of fireflies that are really habitat generalists. So they can live pretty much anywhere. And here in the U.S., we're lucky, at least in the United States, we're lucky to have one particular firefly species. It's sometimes called the Big Dipper firefly, the Canis pyralis, that is a habitat generalist. It can live pretty much anywhere, and that species is doing really well. They're very, very abundant in urban parks like Central Park, Prospect Park in New York City. They're on the Mall in Washington, D.C. They're pretty much everywhere. They're the common firefly that you'll see flying around in the early evening, getting caught in jars, as a matter of fact. And so habitat loss is especially a problem for those firefly species that are that can only live in a particular habitat. So they're habitat specialists, and they might only live, for example, and they specialize in different habitats. So the habitats that are being lost that are of concern are the ones where these particular firefly species can only live there, nowhere else. One example is in the U.S. is a species called the Bethany Beach firefly. Actually, Candace, maybe you want to talk about the Bethany Beach firefly.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this firefly came to our attention because at the moment we only know of 7 locations where it's found, and the largest known population is in this kind of dense urban residential area along the Delaware coast in the U.S., and there's been a lot of building going on, construction. There have been boardwalks built for future vacation homes, and so the habitat of this firefly has really been kind of decimated. The plants have been cut down, and of course you have all the other issues with surrounding residential areas, which is increased light pollution and pesticide use and things like that. But we actually worked with the Center for Biological Diversity last year to petition to have the species considered for ESA listing, Endangered Species Act listing, because we're so concerned about its persistence.
Yeah, so that's a great example from the U.S. Probably endemic to this one part of Delaware, and it only lives in these freshwater wetlands that are very close to the ocean. So habitat loss is a big problem for that one species. Another example is from Southeast Asia, where there are congregating mangrove fireflies. So these are fireflies that where the males congregate in particular trees that are along mangrove rivers, and the males gather in these trees night after night after night, year after year, often in the same trees, and they flash together to attract females. Females fly into these trees, mate with the male, and then the females go maybe a few hundred yards away. They lay their eggs in the muddy substrate that is behind the river's edge. The eggs hatch out into larvae. The larvae spend a couple of months developing. They are predaceous. All fireflies are predaceous as larvae, so they're eating a particular kind of mangrove snail that lives in that habitat. And when they get big enough, they turn back, metamorphose into adults, and hop back into the tree and continue their life cycle. So the mangrove forest along these tidal rivers is being cut down mostly for agricultural use, so oil palm plantations, shrimp farms, and as that habitat is destroyed, it destroys not only the place where the adults are doing their courtship displays, but it also destroys the habitat where the rest of the firefly life cycle and their prey, the larval prey, live. So that's a disappearance of habitat that's going to wipe out those populations of, they're called pteroptics fireflies.
So it sounds like a case in which you have such a high number of species and such a varied set of life histories that habitat loss is probably hitting them from many different directions around the globe.
And habitat loss interacts, right, Michael, with a lot of other things like.
Right. So as habitat's lost, another worry is that it's fragmented. And for a lot of these fireflies, they are very poor dispersers. If they get cut off from the rest of the population, they don't really have a way of joining them. And small populations are at risk from random events like a bad winter or something like that. So almost anything that causes habitat loss that you can think of is affecting some firefly somewhere. And degradation can be a bad thing too. If your habitat might be there, but it's getting to be lower and lower quality, and that could be because of alteration of the landscape or a pollutant or something like that.
And I'll just jump in to say that climate change and habitat loss obviously interact very strongly. And so recently got an email from a firefly expert in Australia who said that for Australia, actually, surprisingly, the biggest threat that she perceives to fireflies in Australia, which are kind of flying under the radar, most Australians don't even know that there are fireflies in Australia. But Leslie Ballantyne, Dr. Leslie Ballantyne does, and she considers drought to be the major threat to fireflies in Australia, and now also fires. And so there are the fireflies in Australia, as in most places, rely on a certain amount of moisture during all stages of their life cycle. And so drought associated with climate change is causing places that used to be suitable for fireflies, those habitats have been degraded or disappeared, so they're no longer appropriate habitat for fireflies. And so she considers continuing drought in Australia and fires associated with that drought to be major threats to fireflies there.
Okay, so I think that gives our listeners a good baseline for some of the threats that are related to habitat loss. Let's move on to the second highest scoring item, though, which is one that a lot of the media coverage about your article has been focused on, which is artificial light at night. How does that pose a particular problem for fireflies?
Candace.
Well, artificial light at night is a real issue for species that are communicating with light, which is a lot of our firefly species, especially as adults. All of the larvae make light, but basically light drowns out their signals. So if you think about, it's two fireflies flashing to each other and trying to communicate, find each other to mate. When you have a lot of other light in the environment, it makes it more difficult for them to see those lights and to respond to each other.
Yeah, so one of the cool things about, I don't know if it's cool, but one of the second part of our paper, in addition to the reporting the results of the survey, we had about 50 respondents who scored all of the threats. And so we report the results of the expert opinion survey. We also review all the evidence that we have for how these particular threats, the scientific evidence that has been accumulating over the years for how these threats do affect firefly populations. And it's really only in the last 10 years that we've got very good information from experimental studies on how artificial light disrupts courtship. And we know that it does in a couple of different species, and so in several different species. So a lot of studies have been done on adding light at night to the environment of the common European glowworm, which is the species is Lamparus noctiluca. It's found pretty much all over Europe, and it's the only firefly species that occurs in the UK. So a lot of studies have been done on it, and what those studies have found is that all different types of artificial light at night decrease the ability of males to find the females. So the females, as Candace pointed out, these are this is a species where the females glow, the males don't glow as adults, and they fly around looking for something that's glowing down on the ground. The females are also flightless. And so, hence the name glowworm. They're glowing to attract males. And the males can't find the females if there's a certain level of artificial light at night. It's also been shown for the flashing lightning bug fireflies in the United States, again, for several different species, that if there's artificial light, the males will continue to flash, but the females don't respond. And so all of this is pretty good evidence that artificial light interferes with the courtship signals of these glowing or flashing fireflies and will diminish their reproductive success.
And I'm wondering, does the frequency of that light matter at all, or is it just generally speaking any form of light will interfere with their courtship displays?
So different species of fireflies have different visual sensitivity, and in some experiments that have been done on some Asian fireflies in Taiwan, they're sensitive to one particular wavelength of light, one color of light, whereas fireflies in the U.S. are sensitive to other wavelengths of light. And so you could tune the color of light, but it might not work for all fireflies. So one reason for that change in visual sensitivity is that evolutionarily they've diverged from a common ancestor. They're occupying different environments. And also, different fireflies are active at different times of night. So the fireflies that are active in the evening have a very different visual system than the fireflies that are active late at night. So there are many different kinds, frequencies, wavelengths of artificial light have been tested, and they all pretty much, all the ones that you would see, street lights and floodlights and things like that, they all have the same effects, similar effects on firefly courtship.
So we're not getting out of that problem easily by tweaking the color temperature of our streetlights or something like that.
Correct. There was some hope that we might be able to do that, but as more information has come in from scientific studies, it has become clear that there's no magic bullet color for light that would be firefly friendly. We in the paper we make several suggestions about things that we can do to reduce the impact of artificial light at night on fireflies.
Okay, and I hope we get into that in just a second. But before we do, I wanted to chat just really quickly about pesticide use. And are fireflies affected in any ways uniquely as a result of, their exposure to pesticides? Or is this a common problem that is, similar to that which would be faced by, all insects?
Candace.
Yeah, so there are actually, as we mentioned in our paper, there are very few studies looking at direct impacts to fireflies. I believe there's only been 2 published studies looking at how pesticides affect them, but we can infer effects from studies on other species of beetles. And we can also think about how pesticides such as herbicides might affect their habitat, which is true for many other invertebrates, or even thinking about how it might affect their prey, which are these soft-bodied invertebrates like slugs and snails and earthworms and things like that.
Yeah, and I'll just mention that quite recently, just in the last couple of years, there was a study done. I think it was done in Maryland, and it was a field study comparing insect abundance in corn plots that had been planted either with like regular corn seeds or corn seeds that had been treated with neonicotinoids. So nearly all of the listeners might not know that nearly all the corn and soybean seeds sold in the United States are routinely coated with various neonic insecticides, including imidacloprid. And in this study, what they found was that in the corn plots that had been planted with the neonic treated seeds, there was quite a substantial, about a 70% reduction in the abundance of adult fireflies compared to the control plots. Now, this is just one study, and but the authors of the study, their opinion was that this was most likely due to higher mortality of the firefly larvae in the soil as a result of leaching of the insecticides that were on the seeds into the soil. One thing that many people don't realize about fireflies is that they're not just like the very ethereal adults that we see flying around at night. They actually have a life history, life cycle where they spend quite a lot of the majority of their lifespan is spent, in the case of U.S. fireflies, underground. And so in the larval stage, also in the egg and in the pupal stage, fireflies get exposed to any kind of toxins, pesticides, pollutants that are in the soil. And so that's something that people don't necessarily think about. If you apply something to your soil, it's going to affect fireflies, larvae, in addition to any other pest insects that you might be trying to get rid of.
And the way insecticides work, they tend to be broad spectrum. So they do things like interfere with neurotransmission. So there's not a particular spray we use to just kill mosquitoes. It kills all invertebrates. So it's hard to get out of the way of that.
That's quite interesting. And I think we've given our listeners probably by now a pretty grim view of the potential future for fireflies. And I'm wondering now what we might do to discuss some of the things that might mitigate some of these effects or reverse them or ensure that these species, which are so charismatic and well-loved, are with us well into the future.
Yeah, so one of the things I really, really want to emphasize is that in this paper, we did not say that fireflies are going extinct. What we were trying to do was to kind of get out in front of what people are reporting, and in some cases we have good evidence for declining populations of fireflies. And by getting out in front and identifying what the threats are to these firefly populations, we're hoping that we can keep fireflies around for a long, long time. So I think the message in our paper is much more hopeful than perhaps the media coverage led people to believe. We really, we think that what we're really hoping to do is to be able to identify specific firefly species that actually are more at risk from these threats than other ones. And we talked about the lightning bug fireflies, especially the ones that fly in complete darkness, might be more susceptible than others to light pollution. The habitat specialists and the dietary specialists are going to be more susceptible to habitat loss and degradation. Unfortunately, all fireflies are going to be susceptible to pesticides. But so once we're able to identify the species that are most at risk from these threats, we can actually develop plans to preserve them. And so I think our message is really a hopeful one, that we're working really hard to try to keep fireflies around for a long, long time.
And one of the other things is to get people out and monitor it, because there's very little that's been done except for a few species. And this could be a good opportunity for citizen science to come out and contribute. If you aren't monitoring, you don't even know what species are around, it's hard to figure out what to do to protect them.
That's a really, really important point. So with 2,000 different species of fireflies around the world and their global distribution, this is really monitoring firefly populations to track long-term trends in species abundance over time. It's a big job. And so we could really use help from citizen science projects like Firefly Watch, which is now run by Massachusetts Audubon Society, but it is all across North America. So anybody who is willing to help us collect data on firefly abundance, we just need to know what species it is, and then tracking abundance over time would be really, really useful. So I would encourage people who are interested in contributing to this citizen science effort in the U.S., or there are many in other countries too, to start going out at night just like once or twice a week during the firefly season and count the flashes in their backyard. It would be so helpful for us.
To build on that too, things that people can do, I think collecting baseline data is really critical to understanding, where our fireflies are and how they're doing, but also just really simple actions like preserving habitat, restoring habitat for fireflies, thinking about those different life history needs and providing for that, whether you have a yard or you're working with someone in the natural area, and doing what you can to, eliminate or control light pollution, whether it's turning off outside lights at night or using motion sensors so they're not on all the time. And really considering, cosmetic uses of pesticides and is this necessary? Do I need to apply it? And holding off if not.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And so, I think that it's pretty much, if people have been paying attention, it should be on their radar that monocultures of lawns are really, really not a good way to protect Earth's biodiversity. And that is something that also applies to fireflies. So if you think you need to have a really, really green lawn and you're going to be maintaining that lawn by putting down a lot of pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, you're going to be killing fireflies. And so you can't both want to have a really beautiful manicured lawn and have fireflies in your lawn over the long term.
It's time to redefine beauty.
Time to redefine beauty.
Have your lawn look like an old field. Do work with native plants. If you do that, you can cut back on watering, cut back on pesticides, rethink the lawn.
Yeah, and you'll have a lot more fireflies because, as we mentioned earlier, fireflies really need moisture in all their different stages, especially like the eggs and the larvae are very susceptible to desiccation. If your grass is longer, if you have a meadow instead of a lawn, the soil will retain moisture for a much longer time, and firefly larvae or firefly females are going to love that for laying their eggs, and the larvae will survive better too. We'll have more fireflies.
Yeah, we always tell people to embrace the wild and allow little unkempt areas, and even things like leaf litter or down logs can provide habitat for fireflies as well, and that also helps improve the moisture.
Definitely.
Well, I think that's a fantastic note on which to leave it. One in which people can provide fireflies better habitat by not doing something, perhaps, rather than by doing something. I'd like to thank you all very much for joining me today. Those sound like great actionable next steps for people and also for research. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, James.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.